You've heard a lot about the technology, the practices, the methods, how we're going to get there using connectivity to get the cars to relate to each other, to the infrastructure, and read their own environment, and make that picture work. But this may surprise you until you think about it, but autonomous cars really are not about self-driving. That's just the means. Autonomous cars are about a much bigger set of ends, which include changing the efficiency of transportation, road usage, fuel usage, number of cars needed per population to accomplish transit goals, a whole lot of things that are really big picture, not just getting a car to steer and brake, accelerate, and so forth. That's where our next panel is going to go. So we're going to do one of these where we do the 3 short talks, and then we're going to take some questions. I'll have a couple, and I want you to come on up as well and take the mics again as you hear about these ideas. So 3 short blasts. Let me bring up our panel all at once here. First of all, please welcome Kyle Vogt, who is the CEO of Cruise Automation. Come on up, Kyle. Mark Platshon is Managing Director at Icebreaker Ventures, also a Senior Advisor to BMW iVentures. Welcome, Mark. Big endorsement there. Thank you. And we've also got Paul Godsmark here as the CTO of the Canadian Automated Vehicles Center of Excellence. Okay, let's hear Kyle's view first. Give us your thoughts.
All right, thanks. Thanks for having me. So I wanted to talk first about the question of what we're doing to prepare and how long that will take, what our current preparations look like for these things. And in order to understand that, I wanted to see, how is the industry thinking about this? And we can look back, one of my favorite examples is airbags. This is one of those technologies that is like an obvious good thing. It makes people safer and reduces injuries. That's something we want in all of our cars. And so much so that the government stepped in and mandated it and said that all new cars need to have airbags. And so that's pretty much as you can do to support a new technology. That's like cranking the dial to 11. And what happened then? It still took 30 years to get to 95% market penetration in the vehicle fleet in the United States. So when I look at some of the technologies that are in the pipeline right now, I'm a little concerned about that. You've got things like V2V and V2I, which are sort of proposed as some of these solutions for accelerating the adoption of autonomous features, but I don't see how that's going to happen with these technologies. We could consider, a best case scenario. Let's assume that the government steps in and mandates that 100% of new vehicles have both V2V and V2I features. That in itself is kind of a big step. But if that happens, how long would it take? And how much time do we have to prepare? I think, again, this best case scenario, let's say after the first year, 5% of all the cars in the US have this technology. That's kind of how it went for airbags. How does that look for V2I? The problem is, of course, you need both the vehicle and the infrastructure. So if you're one of those people that goes out and buys that new car that's got this V2I feature and you want to use it, you have to be in an area that has this support. And as I think Bernard was saying before, you've got to get the community to sign up. You've got to find someone to pay for it. You've got to have the data to prove that it's good before the infrastructure is going to be in there. So that's going to be a problem. If it's going to take 30 years for all the cars to have the feature, and we have to get every local government to adopt and pay for this thing, it's not going to happen. So if you have a job in V2I right now, you should probably look for a new one. The second one is V2V. So V2V, it's got some similar problems. So again, you need both the V and the V, as in your vehicle has to have the technology and the other one that you want to interact with. So for example, again, in the first year, let's say 5% of the US vehicle fleet has V2V technology installed. The probability that 2 random vehicles who meet on the street will be able to talk to each other with V2V is 5% of 5%. So that works out to 1 in 400 times you're actually going to get the benefit of this technology. That pretty much rounds to 0. Even after a decade, it's still going to be less than 1 in 5. 1 in 5 times after 10 years of deploying this technology, our 2 vehicles going to be able to talk and negotiate, either prevent an accident or see around a corner or whatever it is people are saying about these technologies. I just don't think that's going to happen. So what does it look like? If it's not 30 years, because I don't believe that we would get behind something that's going to take 30 years, what does it really look like? And I think the thing that we need to realize is that autonomous vehicle technology is unique. If I said to you, you could have an extra hour added onto your day every day, You could play with your kids. You could, I don't know, watch Netflix, whatever it is you want to do. An extra hour a day, what would you do for that? How much would you pay for that? Would you care, if there were autonomous vehicle technology and it came from someone other than an OEM, perhaps? Would you be loyal to the existing car maker where you've bought your last 10 cars if they didn't have this technology? Would you care if it's a tech company or a startup? Would you even care what the car looks like if it can give you an hour a day back on your life? This is a pretty big deal. I think the answer to that is no. You don't care about any of these things, which makes this kind of technology unique. We haven't seen anything where it's compelling enough to convince people to abandon all their traditional behaviors and go out and buy this thing. Sorry, I'm just checking my notes here. So I think another thing to realize is, because of the reasons I just said, this kind of technology is going to become the #1 driver of auto sales. I don't think it's going to be the brand of the car or whether it has leather seats or a fancy interior. It's not going to be infotainment. It's not going to be connected car features. It's not going to be an iPhone app that comes with it. It's going to be how well does it drive itself? Can it actually give me that piece of time back? And if the answer is yes, then people are going to buy it. And I don't think they're going to care about the form factor. Again, whether it's from an OEM or an aftermarket product or even something that a tech company or Uber or Google puts together, this is going to have an overwhelmingly powerful demand. And I don't think that many of the OEMs today, especially some of the people here, really understand that. I've heard one auto exec say something to the effect of, our customers are never going to want autonomous vehicle technology because they love driving so much. And I don't understand that. Has he never driven in LA traffic? This is that's not something I'd want to do. So assuming this is all the case, how does this affect highway transportation? How does it affect you and me? What can we do about it? Well, the good news is this is one of those things where if you have it on your vehicle, it's going to work. You get all the benefit. That's good. If you don't have it, fortunately, I believe not much is going to change. There's a lot of things going around, like proposed benefits for this kind of technology. I'm going to talk specifically about highways because that's what I work on. So first, I've got a list of things that I think won't happen, and that's V2I technologies. I've talked about it before. You need both vehicles to have this, and there's a slow adoption rate. And I think that, I'm sorry, V2I, yeah. And the other issue is that the data that we may be providing from V2I systems now will probably be obsolete by the time it's widespread, in many places across the US. You can imagine whatever engineers think we need today will probably be completely wrong in 10 years. So we may spend all this time and effort building out this infrastructure and then never actually use it. So I wouldn't count on V2I being a benefit in the short term, and it's not something we need to worry about. Something I'm kind of on the fence on is using high occupancy vehicle lanes for autonomous vehicles. Like, what would that do? You could get some benefits in efficiency, perhaps from having platooning, but the problem is even when you do that, those cars eventually have to merge back into the regular traffic. So unless you have a completely separate infrastructure or lane that is disconnected from the sort of human-driven lanes, I don't think you're going to see those benefits. And building out that infrastructure is, again, sort of the same problem with V2I. And I think, okay, so there are some things that I think will happen in the short term, assuming there's adoption that's driven by something other than maybe the traditional 30-year cycle. And unfortunately, the first one is more traffic. If you tell people that commuting is now less painful and you get that hour of your life back, anytime you take pain away from something, more people do it. And so we're going to have more people on the roads, more people choosing to commute, people moving away from the cities into cheaper areas because it's no longer painful or costly for them to commute in terms of their time. And so unfortunately, I think we are going to see more traffic. And a lot of these proposed benefits of having self-driving car technology on the highways may not make up for that. And the last thing I think is that if people do end up seeing the benefits of autonomous vehicles on highways, it's cutting into that 30% of California workers who commute more than an hour a day. I think that's going to accelerate the adoption of this technology into our city streets. So if you thought maybe that was 20 years out before, I would factor in that people are going to get a taste of this for what it's like on the highway and then want that everywhere else in the streets. Obviously, I'm a believer that it's going to happen on highways first. So to wrap this up, so I think the rollout of autonomous vehicles is sort of unique compared to any other technology. It's going to be driven by this overwhelming demand for people who want to have that extra hour a day of their life back from their commute. And I don't think that that demand is necessarily going to be satisfied by the traditional OEMs unless they dramatically change their way of thinking. It could very much be through the aftermarket or through a tech company who develops this technology. And fortunately, I don't think we need to do much to our existing infrastructure. And if you don't have this technology, it's not going to harm you very much in the short term. It's not going to be like our highways are overtaken by these self-driving cars. And I think that's kind of where we're going to end up, at least until the day when we decide that humans are no longer allowed to drive on highways. And that's it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Predictions are hard, especially when they're about the future. But in this case, it's not real hard to predict whether we're going to have autonomous cars. We're going to have autonomous cars. We're going to have an autonomous world. What we don't know is exactly when, and we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. So let's talk about that for a little bit. Cities, economies, and societies are built around their transportation. You have a river, you end up with a city. You build a beltway, you end up with suburbia. So we have control over what we build. In How We Got to Now, Steve Johnson, it's a great book, you really ought to read it, argues that there's he sort of traces the 6 big technology changes that changed the world. And I want to use that framework to talk a little about what we might envision for the future. To give you an illustration of what he's talking about, he argues that the printing press actually created medicine and astronomy. Now, wait a minute. The printing press created more stuff to read. Maybe it distributed information better. But how did it create these other things? Well, it turns out that we didn't know how many people were farsighted until they had something to read. So all those people who were glass makers, who were busy making green and brown bottles for beer, figured out how to make clear glass because they needed to satisfy the lens business. And then they made spectacles, and there was a huge industry of making spectacles. Well, some of those guys put 2 lenses together and said, holy cow, amazing, cells, bacteria. Others put them the other way around and looked at the skies and said, holy cow, stars, planets, moons. So out of that, we ended up with those industries and all the ones that spawned out of that. So if you were the strategic planner at the time who said, I want to solve health problems, go make me a printing press, the connection's a little tenuous, right? That's the challenge now with saying, okay, we're going to have autonomous cars. They're going to do more than just park themselves and connect to Pandora. What are they going to change in our society? So I'm going to go out there and say, autonomous cars with these nonlinear effects are going to change, they're going to fix the affordable housing crisis, they're going to boost the economy, they're going to fix the healthcare system, and they're going to completely change the way we think about vacation economy. Now, those are not linear conclusions, right? So let me tell you a garage story, Silicon Valley garage story. I was in San Francisco talking to a friend of mine who told me, I sold my car. I said, what are you going to get? Because I always like to tell people which BMWs, they should buy. And he said, I'm not buying a car. I'm going to use Uber every day, And on weekends, I'm going to either rent from Relay Rides a convertible on some weekends and a four-wheel drive on other weekends, and we're done. We're not buying a car. I'm like, whoa, interesting. And his wife chimes in and says, and we're converting the garage to a student apartment, and we're going to put it on Airbnb. So I bet you haven't heard anybody connect Uber and Airbnb, but there's tens of thousands of garages in cities that could become affordable housing, student housing, increase the density and functionality of cities, and at the same time work. So this whole idea of having access to transportation rather than ownership of transportation is being enabled, of course, by Uber and Lyft and Relay Rides that I've mentioned, but it's also being pioneered by the big brands. BMW with Drive Now, Mercedes with Car2Go. Avis bought Zipcar for a reason. This is a huge trend. Another story. $200 billion, that's what that is. $200 billion. What's it wasted on? Did this work? It's wasted on insurance, that's right. American American drivers pay $200 billion a year, every year, for car insurance. What can we do with that money? We could give $1,000 per person back to them as discretionary spending. $2,000 per family would make a huge difference in the discretionary spending of the American consumer family. So here's another idea. I'm going to argue, we have the Affordable Care Act, and there's lots of arguments about that. I would argue we don't need it. We don't need any of that. What we need is the Avoidable Health Care Act. If we get autonomous cars, maybe we don't have 33,000 fatalities a year. Maybe we save 2.5 million ER visits. Maybe we save 200,000 people hospitalized and the $18 billion a year that costs. And put that back to productive use in society rather than going away. Meanwhile, take that load off of every ER and every hospital, you've fixed the healthcare problem. Let's talk one more. How far do people want to drive before you start getting tired? How far do you want to drive before you wish you flew? I would argue flying ain't so great. If I want to go somewhere and take my wife, my kids, my backpack, my mountain bike, and my dog, how much is that going to cost me on a spur-of-the-moment flight to go to the Grand Canyon? A lot. Well, what if I could just get in the car right now and go to sleep, watch a movie, eat a snack, and wake up at the Grand Canyon in the morning for the incremental cost of a few electrons? I think that's where we're going to go. And personally, I'd enjoy it a lot. Imagine driving down the road at 75 miles an hour, car's on autopilot, you flip a switch, it blacks out all the windows, you now have real privacy. So airplanes have the 40,000 mile club. Cars are going to have the 75 mile an hour club. So SimCity is a game, right? SimCity is, you envision a future world and you decide what do you put in and what do you take out. And I think all the people who do strategic planning for the autonomous car world need to play SimCity and think about, what comes out. Parking lanes, body repair shops, gas stations, a lot of other stuff. What goes in? A whole bunch of stuff. And sort of model that out and start to think about where should we be investing in order to enable the real benefits of the autonomous world besides just having a smart parking car. Thank you.
having problems with the system. It's not forwarding. Okay. So, autonomous vehicles, is the technology coming faster than our preparations for it? And my answer is an emphatic yes, the technology is coming much faster. Or to put it another way, are we prepared? And the answer is no. Why do I say that? Because the technology is going to be here soon, much sooner than we expect. There are going to be huge socioeconomic impacts. It's going to affect all aspects of our daily life. It's not in any of our future plans, and it is potentially disruptive. So here soon, the automakers are telling us that they're going to have highly automated vehicles anytime between 2020 and 2025. Elon Musk says that we're going to have fully autonomous cars 2023. Meanwhile, Google is saying that they aspire to have their technology in public hands by 2017 to 2019. We're not prepared for it that soon. And at Cavco, we estimate that we're going to reach a tipping point sometime around 2026 when maybe 20% or more of the trips being made on the road network are being made by autonomous vehicles, which is going to have an unstoppable momentum to see this through. In terms of the huge impacts, the safety, if we could save 80% or more of the 34,000 fatalities on the US roads every year, that would be an incredible benefit. And as noted earlier, that's going to have an amazing impact on the healthcare system. And there's an entire organ and tissue donation industry that relies on road fatalities. What are we going to do about that? We're not prepared for that. There's about 5.5 billion hours lost on US roads every year. The value of that time is just amazing. We need to prepare for that. And then the huge one, the game changer for me, is the transportation as a service model. In this model, it's a bit like Uber or Lyft on steroids. Basically, you order up the vehicle on your smart device, it comes to you, and dependent on whether you're traveling to work or you're going away for the weekend, you get a vehicle appropriate to that trip, and at the end of the trip, you off-hire it. That's going to end up saving the average person money because they don't have to pay for the depreciation of a vehicle that they own. It's more sustainable, and it's more environmentally friendly. Morgan Stanley estimated that the US would save $1.3 trillion a year if autonomous vehicles are fully deployed. And at Cavco, we estimate that the money flows around that, because that 1.3 trillion, that's about 8% of GDP. We estimate that when you bring in the bigger picture, when you look at the existing businesses whose business model is going to be impacted or even disrupted, when you look at the change in land values because people are traveling further and sprawl is increasing, we're expecting to see money flows around 20% of GDP. And it's going to change every aspect of our daily life. Just think back 100 years ago, if any of you can, about how the invention of the modern motor car changed society. It changed how we lived. And we believe that the autonomous vehicle is not only going to, it's going to change how and where we live and work. So I talked about sprawl. We're going to get greater sprawl. If your working day can start when you get in your car and ends when you get out of your car, you can afford to live a lot further away, which means the house prices go down. Think about mobile offices. You might want to have an office, work in a mobile office. Why pay very expensive downtown rents when your office can drive you to your meetings and to your site visits? And then there are 30% of the population that don't have a driving license. Many that are seniors, disabled, too poor, too young. Their lives will be transformed. It's not in our future plans. When you look at the long-range transportation plans, when you look at city plans, you look at parking and transit, none of them take into account this. And these plans are looking 30 years out. And we're looking at spending billions of dollars on infrastructure, which you can't change once you've built it. But we're not planning it for this autonomous future. So parking, for instance, we've got all these parking lots and parking structures in downtowns, and we're looking at building big developments with loads of parking. But in about 5 years' time, we'll probably see a reduction. I'm pretty certain that California is considering a $60 billion plus high-speed rail project. And I just got to ask the question, has anyone done any due diligence against the impacts of autonomous vehicles on the business and operational model for that? It'll be an interesting outcome if we do that calculation. And then every government department is going to be impacted by this technology, not just the transportation department. Obviously, the health system will be affected, the education system will be affected. The tax and revenues will be different in this new world. And pensions, I talked about many of these established companies where our pension funds are invested. Many of those will be impacted, some will be disrupted, and money will be flowing into the new business models and the new companies. So even our pensions are at risk here, and we're not planning for this. So I see the upsides of this technology as being absolutely transformational. I see there being a paradigm shift, the very fact that the vehicle can drive itself. It's so new, we're just not ready for it. And the new business models that emerge are going to be, we just can't imagine them. It's like a physical internet. And then the downsides, the technical challenge is absolutely formidable. It's not an easy task to get vehicles to drive themselves. We're going to be facing privacy, security, and liability issues with this technology. And one thing I'm very concerned about is that if we have this point-to-point, this door-to-door service from this transportation as a service model where we stop owning our own vehicles, then we're going to get even more obesity than we currently have. And of course, it's disruptive to our business and operational models, and none of us like change, or if we do, we don't like wholesale change, and we've got to get prepared for that. So I'm saying, let's plan now, let's get some good policies in place around this technology. Let's do our due diligence. If we're going to spend billions of dollars on infrastructure, let's make sure that we're planning that infrastructure for how transportation is going to change. Let's maximize the benefits, and let's minimize the downsides. So I'm saying, let's get ready, update your plans, particularly your operational and business plans. Thank you.
Our panel, thank you very much. Please a big thanks for Kyle Vogt of Cruise Automation, Mark Platshon of Icebreaker Ventures and advisor to BMW iVentures, and also Paul Godsmark, CTO for the Canadian Automated Vehicle Center for Excellence.